Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Community from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to another episode dealing with this season's topic, History and Our Current World, where we examine the importance of myths, memories, and the creation of narratives in global politics. Today, we'll speak to Jason Steinhauer about how history is changing in the digital age.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Jason formerly served as founding director of the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest, as a global fellow at the Wilson Center and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and as an adjunct professor at the Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He has been a contributor to Time, CNN, and Real Clear Politics, was a past editorial board member of the Washington Post's Made by History section, a former presidential counselor of the National World War II Museum, and an expert speaker for the U.S. Department of State. He also worked for 7 years at the U.S. Library of Congress. Jason's book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past, examines how social media shapes what we know about the past. He is also the founder and CEO of the History Communication Institute, which comprises 150 scholars and practitioners on 6 continents. Let's listen in on the conversation. All right, welcome back, folks. And for this week's episode of Diplomatic Community, I'm going to be joined by my friend Jason Steinhauer, who has written a book called History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. And a lot of what Jason talks about fits in very well with our topic of history in our current world and what we're talking about this season. And, you know, a lot of the things we talked about with Margaret McMillan in her episode about how things have changed in the history landscape over the past 15 years since she wrote that book, Jason's going to fill in that void because he talks a lot about social media and the internet and how it relates to history. So excited to have him here today. Jason, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show again, or on the podcast again. Just a quick apology to listeners. I do have a little bit of a respiratory infection that I'm getting over. So if I sound a little gravelly, if I sound a little hoarse, that's why. This is not how I normally sound. So just bear with me, and hopefully the voice holds up for our conversation.
Yeah. Jason was not on a rager last night, so he's just getting over a cold.
I haven't been on a
we know
rager
of.
probably
Yeah,
in
that we
20
know of.
years.
Yeah.
The amount of times I'm awake past 10 p.m. is very small.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that one. All right, so let's get into it. You know, like I mentioned, when I spoke to Margaret McMillan, we did touch upon today's landscape of history as compared to when she wrote the book. And it's not like we didn't have the internet before she wrote her book, but it's changed drastically since she published her book in 2008. And since then, we've seen the advent of social media and the growth of things like YouTube and podcasts and TikTok and Instagram and all these different things. So, yeah, and you talk about this in your book, but have you seen this affect history overall? And, you know, how have we been consuming history since then?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm a huge fan of Margaret McMillan and her book, Dangerous Games. I've actually used that book in my research for my book. I've used it in courses that I've taught. Margaret McMillan was actually on the Scholars Council at the Library of Congress when I worked at the Library of Congress. So I think her book and my book actually sort of work very well with each other, sort of being in conversation with each other.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're right. A lot has changed since 2008, which was already 17 years ago. But what was really surprising when I worked on my book and in the years since the book has come out is to think about how actually so much of the dynamics of the social web have actually not changed. You know, there's a lot of news stories and a lot of changes on the surface to various features or various aspects of the web. And of course, one of the biggest changes to the web is the use of artificial intelligence, and Facebook now uses AI to moderate 95% of its content, and TikTok is one massive AI engine. But, you know, a lot of how social media operates has stayed largely consistent. And a lot of the ways that people communicate history on social media has also stayed largely consistent. So that's actually one of the surprises that came out of doing the research and looking at this sort of critically and from a big picture lens. We can talk about that a little bit more. In terms of the answer to your question, though, how does all has affected professional discipline of history and how people interact with historical knowledge? One of the reasons that the book is called History Disrupted is that actually I feel like this has had a very disruptive effect on professional history, almost to the point where history as a profession might actually eventually disappear. And I know that sounds perhaps a bit hyperbolic or maybe exaggerated, but if you think about what it requires to have a history profession, there are certain ingredients that need to be there. One of which is that people need to be able to make a living to do this professionally. And one of the consequences of having so much social history content devoted to history or so much history content available freely on the web is that it makes people not want to pay for professional historians.
Right.
If I can get all my if I can get all my history information from YouTube or from social media or from Wikipedia or from ChatGPT, then why would I ever pay a professional historian to give me that information? Why would I book a professional speaker who is a historian to come speak to my class when I could just use AI or large language models and run it through some voice AI application to do that for me? Why would I need to take a history class if I could end up just working at Google or Microsoft and never need to worry about history again? So, in part, the whole idea of having professional history was based upon a model where people would pay for that professional expertise. But the web has sort of exploded that model. It's made a lot of information freely available. It's made it now easily to synthesize through AI applications, and you can now even potentially design your own course using information from Wikipedia, YouTube, social media, etc., feeding that into some sort of large language model and having it spit out lesson plans for you. So this all creates a very existential threat to the professional discipline of history. That's why the book is called History Disrupted, and that's why, on the one hand, we might say it's a positive thing to have all this information about the past available online. If it comes at the expense of there not being the support for professional history anymore, then I think we need to question whether how positive that actually is.
Right, because there's a lot of things you lose out by not taking history classes or not learning history and learning how to think like a historian and think critically and the ability to write things and synthesize information and analyze information. And also, there's a difference between what you call this e-history and traditional history, which is also another disruption to this. So can you talk about what is e-history? How do you define it in your book? And how is it different from traditional history? And how does that fit into all of this that we've just been talking about? Because on one hand, yes, there's a lot more history out there for people to go get off of Wikipedia or TikTok or Instagram, all these different feeds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same type of history they would get in a traditional history course or book or something like that.
Right. So I think one of the challenges that professional historians have faced for a long time, even before the social web, but has been exacerbated by the social web, is that the public often tends to think about history as a factual discipline, whereas we in the profession think about it as interpretive. And so what you have on the social web is you have a lot of facts, you have a lot of information that gets regurgitated and recycled and resuscitated through various programs. It starts on Wikipedia. Someone takes it from Wikipedia, makes it into a YouTube video. And then from YouTube, it goes over to TikTok. And then from TikTok, it gets fed into an AI and becomes part of a large language model, right? So you're taking a piece of historical information, it's just getting recycled and repurposed in different formats. But we as historians, what we see ourselves doing is we take lots of different facts and pieces of information and we interpret it. And an interpretive discipline and an interpretive framework for understanding information is far different from just getting a piece of information regurgitated to you by a machine. And so for we as historians, that's where we've been trying to make the case and advocating for over the past 10 to 15 years is that students need to take history classes and there needs to be professional history because it's that interpretive element that matters. And that interpretive element can only really be done by humans. Large language models, social media is terrible at interpretation. And there's been lots of studies that back that up. Maybe down the road, it will improve, but right now it's really bad. So to have an interpretive discipline and to keep that going, we have to sort of be able to continue to make the argument about why that matters and why people are important to enterprise, people who can afford to make a living and earn a living doing this type of work. Now, how that connects to the question of e-history. So in the book, I coin a new term, which I've used to describe all of this history content that proliferates on social media. and that's called e-history. And so my definition of e-history is very simple. Basically, it's a discrete media product that is packaged for consumption on the social web and then which tries to leverage the social web in order to achieve visibility. So basically, you can't tell the entire history of the Civil War in one tweet or one post. So you
Right.
take a small excerpt of it, you package it for social media, whether it be as a tweet or as a YouTube video. And then the key thing is you try to leverage how social media has been designed in order to make sure it achieves visibility, because achieving visibility is ultimately how you get influence on social media. So what you have on the web on any given day are billions and billions of pieces of e-history that are taking little fragments of the past, little fragments of historical information, and then competing among each other for visibility in your newsfeed. And only a small percentage of those actually achieve visibility and influence. So that's the e-history universe that we encounter every day and that we are forced to then try to make sense of. That is a very different thing from, the interpretive disciplinary frameworks that get established inside of a history course and that are used by professional historians to take lots of pieces of evidence and make arguments about the past.
So the problem with that also, as I see it, is that history as interpretation, and we've talked about this in other episodes. History is a multi-causal discipline, and history is muddy, and there's nuance in history. And when you're creating history in this new history format that you discuss, you don't really care about that. You're trying to get clicks. So you're trying to get stuff out that you think people are going to be interested in and click on for any number of reasons. And oftentimes it's, a small video on TikTok or something that doesn't have the space to have nuance in it and talk about other interpretations and things like that. So how is that disrupting things? How is that making it difficult? And how is it moving us away in this larger issue that I talk about in my class and that we've talked about in this podcast of trying to get people to have a better historical sensibility about, and not only just for like history to understand how we got to where we are and how the past affects the issues of today, but also just to be critical thinkers, to be able to better navigate social media and transfer those historical critical thinking skills into, social media literacy and things like that. And losing out on that makes it more difficult moving forward to have those skill sets. So, how does that fit into all of this? And, what are we losing out on when we lose that nuance through these sort of shorter posts? For instance, I talk a lot since the Gaza war began. I've mentioned to my class when I talk about this issue and bring up your book and stuff, I'll mention the fact that there's a lot of folks out there that have gotten involved in the Gaza war one way or the other, and they go watch a 4-minute TikTok video of someone giving the quote history of the Israel-Palestine issue, and then they think they know the history of it, and they can then base their judgments and everything on that. And I'm like, there's so much more than that. There's narratives that both sides have that have been talked about for decades and decades, and somewhere between those narratives is the history, and trying to work your way through that is something you can't do from watching a 4-minute TikTok video.
Right. Well, first of all, I would say that the chances that someone actually watched that 4-minute video in its entirety are very slim.
Well, yeah,
Um,
I'm giving
and-
them too much credit.
Right. I mean, Facebook counts a view as 3 seconds or longer.
Oh my God.
So, I post videos on Instagram about history and I track my analytics. And usually about 50% of the time, the viewers have watched the video for 3 seconds or less. But it still counts as a quote unquote view. So part of the literacy that you talk about is also understanding just what these terms mean in the real world, right?
Yeah.
Something gets 1 million views on Facebook. Well, that means that 700,000 of those views were for 3 seconds or less. So there's really no way in 3 seconds or less to get any nuanced understanding of a very deep
They're literally just reading
geopolitical-
your headline.
right, a deep geopolitical issue like Israel or Gaza or Ukraine or
Yeah.
NATO or anything else, right? So, I mean, this just on the very surface flies against the entire values of the history profession, which calls for deep, reasoned long form understanding of issues. And social media is the exact opposite of that. And so in my book and in my talks that I give, I have this chart, that handmade chart that I made, which is like, shows that doing professional history is like putting a square peg into a round hole, because the values are completely misaligned. I mean, everything that professional history values, which is like deep archival research, taking a long time to sort through massive amounts of evidence to come up to some sort of reasoned conclusion about something, like social media has the exact opposite incentives, right? Social media's incentives basically want you to consume as much as possible in the shortest amount of time possible, and then post about it, right? Because you get rewarded on social media for talking, not for listening. So, you watch 3 or 10 seconds of a video, and then you're encouraged to post your thoughts and reactions. And that's very much opposite to how academic and professional history have been structured. So there's a real, values opposition there. And also just the incentive structures are completely misaligned, right? It doesn't lend itself to deep reasoning or deep critical thinking. And so I think when we look at social media as a whole, I think it's incumbent upon all of us, as part of this literacy exercise that you mentioned, is to ask what incentives are really in this ecosystem, or being created by this ecosystem. And are these the incentives that we feel like are useful, for all aspects of our life? They may be useful for some aspects of our life. If you want to shop for shoes and you want to quickly find a pair of shoes and then show off the new shoes that you bought, well, maybe social media is the perfect place for that, because you can just quickly see a pair of shoes and then quickly post about it. But if you want a really deep understanding of what's happened in the Middle East, maybe those are wrong incentives. Maybe the incentives are something else, right? You should read a lot of sources. You could listen to a lot of experts. You could then synthesize your own ideas and your thinking, and eventually come with some sort of nuanced, long-form conclusion about where you feel on an issue. That's very hard to do in social media, which is why I personally have felt for a long time that this idea of quote-unquote history communication is a really important skill set for professional historians and activists and journalists to have, because you somehow have to marry the values of the history profession and deep research and rigorous scholarship with this ecosystem that privileges the opposite. And how you do that and how you make e-history in that environment becomes a critical skill set in that work.
Yeah, and I want to get into that in a second. But before we go there, on the last episode of Diplomatic Community, we talked to Katie Steinhauer about the ways that Putin and the CCP and the Kim regime in North Korea have all manipulated history and used it to create these narratives that benefit them and help them or their party remain in power, or their family. How does this new landscape of history and the way that we learn our history and get our information, how does that work to the benefit of those that are looking to manipulate history for their purposes to spread misinformation or disinformation?
Well, yeah, I talked about e-history earlier and how it takes a discrete element of the past and packages it for consumption online, and then tries to leverage the visibility of how social media works. Nowhere in that formula is accuracy.
Right.
And the accuracy of a piece of e-history does not matter. What matters is how well you can leverage social media in order to achieve its visibility.
Which is this is all the petrifying part about it, right? I mean, this is what, keeps me up at night.
So, ultimately, places like Facebook and Twitter/X, these are commercial marketplaces. So the more you're willing to spend to get your stuff visible, then the more visible it can become. And it doesn't matter if it's accurate or not. I mean, Facebook claims to have fact checkers, but of course they've just abandoned all their independent fact checkers in the United States. And they do most of this by artificial intelligence. And again, artificial intelligence doesn't check for the interpretive accuracy of anything. Right. So when you're talking about an interpretive discipline, AI is not going to catch interpretive fallacies in historical arguments. It's not what it's designed to do. So, the Russians have spent billions of dollars on historical disinformation. That's not an exaggeration. I mean, they've been doing this, through the Cold War, as we know. But in the modern era, they've been doing this for 15 to 20 years. They have entire divisions inside their military who are focused on this. And they go after the history of NATO. They go after the history of the European Union. They go after American history. They go after histories of colonialism and imperialism. They go after divisions between countries. France hates Germany. Germany hates England. Lithuania hates Germany. Germany hates Latvia. They just go after all these divisions.
Ukraine never existed.
Right.
Yeah.
These historical grievances that various regions have. In the Balkans, I mean, this is on full display. Serbs versus Kosovars versus Albanians, Bulgarians versus North Macedonians. And they exploit it and they inflame it and they create massive amounts of e-history every single day. And they spend a lot of money making sure that it becomes visible online, either through, propaganda channels or through advertisements or through fake pages that are set up ostensibly to look like history pages, but are actually run by Russian bots or Russian administrators and lead you down rabbit holes. And they coordinate across platforms. So stuff starts on Telegram, then it moves over to Reddit, then eventually it moves over to X. This has all been very well documented by disinformation researchers
and then it
across the world.
gets picked up and run by RT or
by the president of the United States.
Right.
It's so sometimes when I talk about this or when other researchers talk about it, it almost comes off as a conspiracy theory. And I get that, but it's real. This actually happens. I mean, it's very well documented.
We did a working group at ISD on misinformation, disinformation. I mean, it's out there plain as day. And,
Right.
The EU has special groups that follow this and track this and try to debunk it and get this stuff out there. The US did have something that did this until December and no longer has it, the GEC. But
well, I would say that the American efforts to counteract this and even the EU efforts to counteract it, in my personal opinion, have been insufficient. I mean, think about the amount of money and resources that Russia puts into this. Again, they have a whole information warfare division where they spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on this, purposefully trying to use history to divide and inflame. And we've never had an appropriate response, both in terms of the amount of investment and in the amount of where this operation would sit, right? And sitting inside the State Department, or inside Department of Homeland Security, a part here, a part there, that's nice, but we've never actually had a coordinated, unified effort. And when I've traveled overseas with the State Department and met with our civil society partners in Europe, who were working on this, they're oftentimes working on shoestring budgets of $25,000 or $50,000 and a grant from either Brussels or Washington. And that's not nearly enough to deal with the scope of the problem. So, right now, obviously, all that's been destroyed. But even before, in the prior 4 years, the amount of resources we were putting towards this were never adequate to deal with the threat. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing the consequences because we literally have millions and millions of Americans who believe the Russian talking points about the war in Ukraine. And that is basically the result of a long, concerted historical disinformation campaign.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff's existential to Putin, right? I mean, his whole goal is to muddy the waters and make things almost unknowable in the terms of people just don't know what to know or what to think. So they just kind of will think anything. And this is all part of his ability then to tell his narrative of history and what's going on to help justify what he's doing. And, that explains why they have such a large budget for something like this and why they push it out as much as they do.
Yeah. And Margaret McMillan does a great job in her book of pointing out that this is not a new phenomenon.
Right.
People have been doing this for decades. But the combination of this ideology and weaponization with the technology that we now have.
Yeah. It's
right, where you can literally pump out content all day long with bots and machines and push it out through social media with no checks, no filters, and virtually no effort, right? That creates a far bigger challenge and problem than we've arguably faced in the past.
Yeah.
We don't want to depress them too much.
Yes. So moving forward, what can be done? I mean, you're on a podcast. I have a podcast. I write historically framed things for smaller publications and things that are, 1,200 words, 1,500 words. You've got a Substack. We are in this space to some extent. And others often talk about the fact that, yes, it's not perfect, but we can't leave the field to those that will create inaccurate history or push out misinformation and disinformation through their use or misuse of history. So how do we as historians respond to this?
I don't think this is something that historians can do by themselves, which is why I've tried for the past couple of years to build coalitions with people beyond the profession. I've tried to build coalitions with tech partners to think about the designs and incentives in this ecosystem and how we build new ones. I've tried to build coalitions with journalists who obviously have access to large audiences and large publications that can reach more people. Tried to build networks with philanthropists who'd be willing to step up and fund more of this work. tried to build partnerships with governments, a deep relationship with the State Department for 7 years, which unfortunately now seems like it might come to an end because this is too big of a task for professional historians who are chronically under-resourced and overworked to take on their own. I kind of look at what's happened with journalism over the past few years, where the idea of saving journalism and saving democracy through accurate information has really started with the journalism profession raising the alarm about what was happening to its own ecosystem, but has then extended out to other parts of civil society where people have said, okay, we think journalism is important enough that we in tech or we in government or we in philanthropy are going to provide funds to save it. It hasn't been a perfect process, right? The media is still under attack. There are still newspapers laying off people, but there are also some hopeful signs where you see some local initiatives that have been very well funded to sort of fix the news desert problem, and also pipelines for younger journalists to be trained and get into the workforce. And so I feel like we sort of need to make similar arguments for history. It needs to extend beyond just our professional confines and has to be a whole of society approach. And we have to make the argument that professional, accurate, honest history is as essential to a functioning democracy as accurate and independent journalism. And so that's kind of how I've shifted a lot of my public advocacy and sort of trying to build that coalition. And it's hard work and it doesn't always succeed, but there have been little glimpses here and there that the message has started to get through. I think for operating inside the history profession, again, I sound like a broken record, but I really do feel like we have to think more critically about how history operates inside of our current media ecosystem. It's fine to write scholarly journal articles for each other, and it's fine to write 400-page academic monographs if you want to try to get tenure or if you just have a really big topic that you want to take on. But part of being a historian in public/public historian today is engaging in these other forms. And so how is it best to do that? How do you reconcile what the incentives of these platforms are versus what the incentives of professional history are? Someone like Heather Cox Richardson has done a great job of doing that.
Yeah.
But she's one of the exceptions, not the rule. So are there other Heather Cox Richardsons out there? Are there courses that could be developed, trainings that could be developed? These are all the types of things we've been trying to do.
The other thing too, you talk about the incentives, and I've been at discussion groups and different things over the past decade where we've talked about the incentivization system in professional history isn't lined up for this. Like you said, departments are looking at somebody that's trying to get tenure and they're like, well, why are you writing for the Atlantic? Why are you writing for your local newspaper? Like, why aren't you writing another journal article that 17 people are going to read if they're lucky? And we have to be able to incentivize this sort of public discourse for a younger generation or the younger generation of scholars, because Heather Cox Richardson is great and what she has done is fantastic. But she was also at a point in her career where she could go do something like that and not worry about tenure. And same thing with like a Kevin Cruz, was big on Twitter and helped edit Myth America, the book that came out a couple years ago, kind of pushing back against these myths that are out there and stuff. So we've really got to work to somehow incentivize this public discourse more broadly within the historical profession. But like you said, I do see that getting a little better and more people recognizing that. I am hopeful for that in the future, but it's academia, man. Things don't happen quickly. So just on that fact, we're so behind the eight ball because social media and this stuff is, rapidly changes and moves forward. And, we're just sitting back looking at all this.
Yeah. And I think history doesn't just happen inside academia. It happens inside museums and archives and libraries and national parks. And so there's a lot of really great work that's been done on the public history side of things around these questions over the past 10 years. But again, to your point, the wall between public history and academia has stayed too rigid.
Yeah.
And so there just needs to be so much more cross-pollination where people inside academia could learn from what's happening at the national parks or what's happening at museums, and people in museums can still get access to the scholarship and the rigorous research that's done inside academia. And that doesn't always happen. I used to go to a lot of conferences and used to go to the academic conferences and it's almost all academics. Then you go to public history conferences and it's almost all public historians. And usually I'm one of the very few people who's going to both.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. The incentives are not great. The silos are not great. But this is what happens, I think, when a profession feels like it's under attack or where there's a sort of limited amount of resources, people become kind of insular, right? They kind of turn in towards themselves. And I experienced this myself when I was in academia. The more it felt like the profession was under attack or losing funding, or the fewer students that were showing up for classes, the more that the department and the faculty just wanted to cling on very tightly to that small piece of land that was disappearing before their feet. And I feel like that's the wrong approach. Like when that's happening, that's a time to reach out and build olive branches and partnerships across disciplines, right? And try to link arms with people. And I feel like the history profession itself is not always great at that. So maybe that's something that the students could teach their faculty members how to do.
Yeah, and there's the issue too of historians over the past decades have been against going out and, writing 1,200 word essays for newspapers or magazines, or getting on podcasts, or writing their own blogs or Substack newsletters and things like that, because it goes against this idea of like, oh my God, I wrote a book on this. I can't explain this in 1,200 words. It's also different timelines. A newspaper reporter will come to you and say, hey, we really love you to write an article on this that just happened this morning in the news. Can you get it to us by tomorrow? And historians are like, oh my God, you want something in a day? So it's also reprogramming our brains and how we think about this. But the last question, and it speaks to getting out there and engaging with the public. We've talked a lot throughout this about the downsides of e-history and social media and the inability to really get into something and show the nuance and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, we're talking about the fact that we need to do it. Even though there's downsides, we should be doing this. I was at William and Mary last Friday giving a discussion on this whole topic of history and current affairs. And a student asked me, how do you reconcile those two competing issues in your head of, I'm not going to be able to show all the nuance and really dive into something in 1,200 words. But if I don't do it, somebody else will be doing it that isn't necessarily doing this as objectively as possible and is doing it with completely political reasons in mind, in a way to try to spin their own narrative. So how do you reconcile your inner thoughts with that?
Yeah. Wasn't it F. Scott Fitzgerald who said the true mark of intelligence is being able to hold two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time and still being able to function?
Yeah.
So, or something like that. I may have butchered
Yes.
the quote. Talking about historical accuracy, right?
Yeah.
Listen, I mean, we live in the world that we currently live in. So we can't ignore the fact that social media not only is the predominant place where people get their news and their history and their information about the world, but its values have also shaped the world in very profound ways. Just look at what's happening with the federal government right now. I mean, the values that Elon Musk has brought, to Washington in terms of slash and burn and efficiency, quote unquote, and, moving fast and breaking things. These are all values that come from
Right.
Silicon Valley and from
Silicon
social
Valley,
media,
yeah.
right? So the values and mores of social media literally shape all aspects of our lives, including history, whether we like it or not. So I think we can be advocates for the values that we think are important. We can speak out against the areas where we feel like social media is having too much of an effect on our lives. And we can educate people about how social media operates, why it functions the way it does, and why there are challenges and problems with that. But at the same time, to the point that you just raised, we're not about to step away from our responsibility to be contributor to the public sphere and to our democracy. And so part of the way that we do that is through social media. It's not the only way. We also
Right.
teach. We
Right.
also do write books and articles, Substack newsletters. We give public talks. I mean, just in this conversation alone, we've touched on a variety of different ways that historians communicate: museums, national parks, libraries, government, universities. And none of those necessarily has to involve social media, right? So it's part of what the ecosystem is. So it doesn't have to be the totality of it. And I think that's also one of the ways that social media sort of tricks us, right? It sort of constantly wants to convince us that everything has to happen in its territory, but it doesn't. There's other places where historical communication and learning can happen. So it's part of the ecosystem. We have to recognize it as such. We can push back against it when we can. We can use it to our advantage when we can. And we should see it as part of the story, not the entirety of the story.
All right. Well, let's keep fighting the good fight.
Amen.
All right, Jason. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks again to Jason for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.